All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session on stream 2, the first day of CrimCon. I am Andy Wilczak. I'll be moderating the session today. Hopefully by now everybody knows and understands that every one of our panelists will have 10 minutes to speak. I will come on at 9 minutes to give a warning. We will save Q&A for the end. Everybody should see a Q&A box on the bottom of their screen. Please post any questions that you have there during presentations, and we'll get to those at the end. If any of you have any questions or concerns or anything like that that we're not able to get to, you can email me at andy@crimcon.org as we move forward. So without further ado, all of our sessions today will go in the order of the program. So today we're going to start with the criminalization and deviance-making of female sexuality.
Okay. Hi, I'm Connie Hassett-Walker. Should I just share my screen?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Okay, so the criminalization and deviance-making of female sexuality. I'm Connie Hassett-Walker. I'm a new faculty member to Norwich University. And the idea for this project came from something a friend of mine said that her teenage daughter said to her. Her teenage daughter was, I gather, being promiscuous in high school and was getting slut-shamed over it. So she said to her, in talking to her mother, she said, "Maybe I would be less promiscuous if you had shamed me more," which made me sad. And it got me to thinking about how we treat women and girls about their sexuality. And it got me to thinking about the patriarchy, which we talk about in feminist theorizing in criminal justice. And I would say that there are the arguments against heterosexual female promiscuity are really grounded in the patriarchy. And they're just I put this out on Twitter once. Can anyone tell me a non-sexist argument against female promiscuity? And I got no replies. So that's kind of the assumption I'm working with. So I was thinking that this might become some sort of interdisciplinary book. So I sketched out the tentative table of contents, the subtopics, looking at, starting with, of course, past research, Crim research on women, girls, and sex. The patriarchy is kind of a theme that's, I'm sure you guys know, male dominance of society running through all parts of society. That would be the backdrop. Then the criminalizing of women and girls' sexuality, citing the work of Meta Chesney Linden, Joanne Belknap, getting into prostitution, rape victims in the justice system, how the definition of rape has changed, the modern Me Too movement, getting into reproductive rights and birth control and abortion law, LGBTQ folks and the law, anti-sodomy laws, then deviating a bit from getting out of my lane as a criminologist a little bit, talking about teenagers and promiscuity and kind of selective slut shaming of girls, some women, including by people who are doing the same things. And then in the global stage, how women get killed for being raped or committing adultery. So these were my thoughts of kind of my next big project to sink my teeth into. So to take you back through a little bit of the history of feminist thought in CJ, Frida Adler and other liberation feminists in the 1970s came up with this really interesting idea that because women were entering the workforce in other traditionally male-dominated areas, they might also be entering the illegal workforce and committing more crime, including crimes traditionally dominated by men. And in fact, we see a rise in women's criminal activity from 1960 to about 1972, upwards of 300%. So it's this idea of, are we seeing the rise of the new female criminal? So that was a good contribution to the field, even though it didn't hold up well empirically, because it gave people something to chew on and test. And so critics pointed out that, in fact, when it was tested statistically, the female crime patterns were actually quite stable, and that most women weren't these new female criminals, as had been suggested, but rather nonviolent petty property offenders. And while female crime did rise during the 1960s, male crime did too. And women's crime rates seemed to climb so much because the numbers were really low to begin with. Then came the radical feminist theorists who argued that the liberation theorists didn't get at the patriarchy, which was the root of the problem, and the system of men's dominance over women, which underlies how women are socialized, how they experience discrimination in the workplace, how they end up in these marginal economic positions. And that radical feminists also stress the importance of investigating men's victimization of women, including rape and intimate partner violence, which was for a while treated more as a family matter than as a crime that should be investigated by the state. And if we take, through radical feminist theorizing, if we take the crime of rape, there wasn't traditionally little regard for the victim, but that began to change during the 1970s with the feminist movement and the push by women to control their own bodies, contraceptive rights, and that rather than seeing a raped woman as damaged goods, feminists and victim advocates argued that women and girls who were assaulted should be viewed as a person, as an individual who had suffered a violation of their personhood. And what they needed was respect and support and empowerment and protection from future harm. So during the summer of 2020, this is when I thought I would start the background reading for this book. This was also the time when I was changing jobs and moving to a new state and trying to be safe because of COVID. So, so it's maybe not such the best time with having a lot of time to start a new research project. And then I came across this article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, which you may have seen. It was published last December. I told my mentor I was a dominatrix, and she rescinded her letters of recommendation. If you haven't read the article, the background is the author was was at the time a doctoral student in a social science field. She lost an assistantship with a prominent writer and ended up having to revert to legal sex work, being a dominatrix in a house dom in a brothel after a 5-year break. She told this to her dissertation advisor, who compounded things by withdrawing her letters of recommendation from Interfolio. So now the author is working, my understanding, I don't know her personally, I just follow her on Twitter. She's working as an adjunct and a dominatrix. And the discussion continues live on Twitter still to this day. So it got me thinking about the issue of sex worker rights. And there are a lot of sex workers who are on social media, Twitter and other, Instagram and other platforms, who talk about the economic conditions. And this is an area that hasn't been addressed a lot in criminal justice literature. Other fields have looked at it. There was a piece in a CJ journal by Sterling and Van der Meulen that talked about it, but it's kind of an undertapped area. There's a sex worker rights movement. That's what the red umbrella symbolizes. I gather fair pay, protection, respect. And sex workers on Twitter will talk about economic issues, such as, here's one tweet: if sex workers went on collective strike, capitalism would collapse in less than a month, I guarantee it. And sex work and sex workers are workers, and more importantly, people, not the punchline for your jokes about last resort labor and workplace harassment. And finally, what sex workers mean when they say threats of violence: rape, murder, assault, loss of employment, and housing. So I'm seeing connections between, like, looking down on a person for their gender. That's what the patriarchy enables, for their gender, being trans or being female, and also their line of work, sex work, and the economic impact of that. And it's made worse by the fact that sex work exists in kind of this quasi-legal gray area. It's on the right, sex worker rights are on the radar of sociologists, like in this piece, if not criminologists. When criminologists talk about how criminologists frame sex workers is either as criminals or as victims. So the thinking goes that either women end up in prison because they've had these long trauma histories, beginning in childhood where they were sexually assaulted, possibly through incest. They run away as teenagers. They fall prey to a pimp who forces them into prostitution. It's not entirely voluntary. They get into drug use to cope with that. So it's a matter of time before they get arrested or end up in jail or prison. Or sex workers are vulnerable to abusive men. They've sometimes been the victim of serial killers because they're women out on the street and they're less likely to be missed, and their complaints are less likely to be taken seriously by the police. Or sex work and prostitution and sex trafficking are linked. It's not voluntary and we need to rescue the participants. Or sex work is degrading to women. So that's typically how CJ people, criminologists frame it. So I have these ideas circling around in my head. So if sex worker rights are validated and respected, it runs counter to the ideas in the patriarchy with the slut shaming and the kind of dismissing women. And it ties back in with what the radical feminist theorists were saying, that we need to attack the patriarchy. And I think it presents an opportunity for myself and other criminologists who are interested to make a contribution in the criminal justice literature, because it just hasn't been done as much. And I think I'm at 10 minutes, so I will take questions at the end. That's me. Thank you.
I was just going to come on with the 1 minute warning.
Okay.
So, thank you.
I'm trying to stop the share. There we go. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connie. Next up, we have sex work, stigma, and psychological empowerment.
Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen here really quickly. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. Thumbs up if you can see it. Anybody? Thanks, Heidi. So good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Kurt Fowler from Penn State University, and this is my partner, Dr. Heidi Grundetjern from Villanova. And this morning we want to talk a little bit about sex work and stigma and the concept of psychological empowerment. Now, the first picture we have here is attached to a quote by Melissa Grant, where she says, along the lines of sex work, whenever we discuss sex work culturally or even academically, we see these women and maybe we see them leaning into a car, or maybe we see their high heels or a short skirt, but we don't see their faces and we don't hear their stories. And that quote really is a call to understand sex work on a much more personal and individual level, to understand that sex workers are not a monolith, that there are many different kinds of people doing different kinds of sex work. And that difference is what we want to talk about this morning. About 3 years ago, a friend of mine called me up and invited me out for margaritas. And who says no to margaritas, even at 9:12 in the morning? Who says no to margaritas? So I go out and she says, I actually wanted to talk to you because I know that you're a criminologist. And I said, yes, I am. Because I am. And she said, well, I have some questions about this new job I have. And I was like, oh, interesting. What's your new job that would require my input? And she said, well, I'm kind of a sex worker and I need to figure out what's legal and what's illegal. Like, where am I allowed to post ads? Am I going to get arrested? Am I going to be victimized? She just had a slew of questions. And I was like, oh, I don't know. Because I had never studied sex work. But through the process of our conversation, I was like, do you know any more workers? And that was the inlet for a 3-year study where I talked to 50 sex workers from all over the world. I reviewed all the literature, and when I was interviewing workers, as Connie pointed out, Dr. Hassett-Walker, excuse me, pointed out, so much of the research is about either offenders or victimization. And I was interviewing people while going through all of this old literature and was asking them about their jobs. I was approaching it, my initial questionnaire was actually taken from a workplace ethnography. So I wasn't asking them about things like victimization or pimps. I was asking them, so walk me through a typical day at work. And many of the people that I interviewed were very surprised by this. Many of them had taken part in sex worker research previously and were like, man, your questions sure are different from other things I've talked about. And that is because the vast majority of previous research on sex work frames them, early research framed them as offenders. These are women who are destroying families and disrupting communities. Then we moved into the new millennium. We moved into the 20th century, and it became these women are victims. We must save them and rescue them. But the people I talked to framed it so differently. They framed it in a sense of agency. I wanted to do this job and I picked it. Or I ran into a circumstance where this became an option, and even though it wasn't ideal, I decided to do it anyway. When they discussed their work, they talked in terms of processes and outcomes. Processes that empowered them, and outcomes that empowered them. Now, don't make a mistake. When I say empowered, I don't mean that everybody's happy all the time and everyone is joyful and leaping around. No, empowered means that they are proud of what they do, they have a sense of accomplishment in what they do, and your day-to-day is like anyone's day-to-day. You have good days, you have bad days. This is an extension on some of the research by Elizabeth Bernstein, who wrote the book Temporarily Yours, a great book about middle-class sex workers. So I was able to talk to all of these workers from around the world about their jobs. And one of the topics that came up most often was this relationship to stigma. Now, I was reading a paper by Dr. Grundetjern about women in drug dealing and their sense of empowerment. And the comments were very similar. This kind of combative view towards stigma. Yeah, I'm normally stigmatized, but screw that. I like what I do. And this is the concept of psychological empowerment and its kind of paradoxical relationship to stigma. All right, stigma says, Goffman says that stigma is, an attribute that you have that has society shunning you. But he also says we need a language of relationships. So it's not just about having an attribute and feeling stigmatized. It's about our relationship to broader society. And one quote that really encapsulates this idea of a combative relationship to stigma that actually empowers me is by Petunia. She says, you really need to not care what other people think. You need to have a really strong personality and be sure of yourself. You need to figure out what they want, the clients, and you have to give it to them. There's so much to unpack in this comment. There's stigma. There's empowerment, not caring what other people think. That's stigmatizing. You need to have really strong personality. That's empowerment. Process. You need to figure out what they want. And then outcome. And then you need to give it to them. So it covers all of the ground that we're interested in talking about today. So when we talked to workers about their senses of empowerment and its relationship to stigma, processes came across in 3 areas and outcomes came across in 3 areas. The 3 areas for the processes were business acumen, sexual prowess, and risk management. These are the hows. The how do they do their job? How? Business acumen. I've always, sex workers are always portrayed as you've got this old hag madam or this really greasy pimp that's controlling these women. You rarely hear about us. We're basically running our own business for all practical purposes. This is a process style empowerment. I am running a business, but there is an adversarial relationship to stigma. You always portray us as having old hag madams or greasy pimps. This is the stigma, and her fighting back is the no, I run my own business. Sexual prowess, a super fun one to talk about with workers, right? A guy wants to be made to feel good, her clients, not get another bored look or another eye roll. You always have to enjoy sex. You have to enjoy the theatrical act. Now, I want to point out that Heather did roll back this comment right after and said, okay, well, maybe you don't have to enjoy sex all the time. There's plenty of workers who don't enjoy sex. I don't really understand that relationship, but they do it because they want to do it and they get paid well to do it, and they get a lot out of it. So she didn't say, eventually she said you didn't have to enjoy sex, but it is a plus. Risk management. Safety is a huge topic for workers when they're talking about how they do their job, the process of doing their job. I'm always going to screen a client better. I wish we had time to go into what screening is because it's fascinating. I'm always going to screen a client better than someone who is just exclusively doing it for money. Even though they might have a financial incentive to keep me safe and working for them, it's still not their safety in jeopardy. She was saying that her safety is best left in her own hands, that she is the best at the process of doing her job more than anyone else. That's empowerment. But again, the stigmatization, right? Others might be involved in my work, but they're not going to be as good at it as I am. The empowerment. Okay. Next part is once you do these empowered processes, according to Zimmerman, you're going to have empowered outcomes. So what are the outcomes? Well, one of the easiest ones to guess, money, right? All of the workers I spoke to talked about the benefit of having money, and even Robert Merton, the famous sociologist who came up with strain theory, said that money is almost a singular representation of status. So I was 18 years old. I didn't have a great degree. I was sitting there pulling in crazy amounts of money, and it felt really good to be a woman and a racial minority and be able to make my own money and set my terms. Obvious. Self-esteem. We hear about self-esteem in sex work recently. There's some more recent reads about it. But this is a great comment from Jessica. When I'm camming and I get a lot of responses in terms of, hey, a lot of people are in my room, even if they're not tipping, that makes me feel really good about my body and makes me feel confident. Now, I also want to throw back, like, bad outcomes versus good outcomes, right? Like, tipping would certainly be better, but the not tipping doesn't affect her empowered outcome. She still feels like it's worthwhile, even though she's not making money at this very moment. Then lastly, Heather, one of my favorite comments in all of the data set, we're basically naked therapists. Many of the workers in the study talked about their pride in their work and the positive outcomes that not only did they receive, but their clients receive as well. That the old trope of sex workers destroying families should be replaced by maybe sex workers helping families. Many of them. Thank you very much. Many of them talked about how they've had clients for many, many years who they know are married, and they know that they're part of a balancing act that gives this person a healthy relationship outside of the economic sexual exchange. So, in conclusion, we need to spend more time and resources studying the relationship between technology and sex work, because much of this agency that we were talking about in these previous slides was facilitated through the internet and the use of technology, keeping them safer, helping them advertise, helping them get clients, helping them grow their business. Next, providers have a really complex relationship with both empowerment and stigma, and it can't just be, oh, I'm stigmatized, therefore it's bad. Oh, I'm empowered, therefore it's good. There is a very complex interplay going on between these two things. And why is it so complex? The last point, because sex work is not a monolith. Many people doing many, many different things, and the people I talked to didn't particularly feel stifled or oppressed. They just felt that society needed to catch up to them, essentially. So thanks so much for your time this morning. It's such a pleasure to be here at CrimCon, and thank you for CrimCon for facilitating all of this and the other panelists this morning. Have a great morning, everybody. Have a cup of coffee on me. Oh, and I'll take questions in the comments.
All right, we're going to hold questions for the end.
Sure.
Kurt, if you can stop sharing your screen.
Boop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our final paper this morning on deviant domesticity. Francesca, Gaunt, take it away.
Once the internet catched up, there we go. Hi everyone, I'm Francesca. I'm in my third year of my PhD at the University of Greenwich in England. Given what we spoke about already, I'm not sure it's really relevant, but I have put a little not safe for work / home, given where we all are. Some of the material I'm going to be talking about might not be suitable for children, etc. So maybe pop headphones in or turn it down a little bit. So my presentation today is going to focus less on the theoretical, although I'm sure it will make an appearance, but more on the data that I've collected thus far during my project. So to get started, I'll go through my research questions and give a very brief background on the literature surrounding digital sex work. Then I'll go on to share some of my findings so far. So my research questions are as follows. In what way do webcam models create their physical space for webcamming? How far, if at all, does the domestic environment influence the construction of space in webcamming? And how is this subculture of sex workers represented within their domestic space? I aim to gain a better understanding of the subculture of webcam performers and the role the domestic plays within these eroticized spaces by conducting online ethnography consisting of observations and interviews. There's been very limited research into webcamming, and I'll explain some of the key literature that's most prominent for this presentation now. Whilst camgirls often work in private spaces, there's an element of public visibility and surveillance. So Hopkins in 2002 notes how, for this rising millennial generation, constant surveillance can be a dream come true, an affirmation of identity. Camgirls make manifest the postmodern desire for omnipresence through communication technologies. Now, Dobson in 2007 states how this has created a new discourse of power for women. It's a rejection of the traditional attitudes surrounding women. Visibility is something that is desired, that carries wealth, success, and power within society. Now, camgirls and their bedroom spaces have become synonymous to the blurring between public and private realms. The internet allows for new opportunities for sexual solicitation and consequently have blurred the gap between the public and the private. Loers notes how the spectacle of the everyday, the intimate view of the private life, has always been a force in Hollywood spectatorship. Weintraub and Kumar in 1997 continue stating how some scholars have suggested that communication technology may be dissolving the boundaries between the public and the private, which 23 years later appears more true than ever. Lastly, there's been a focus on more traditional forms of sex work within literature. Webcamming as an industry has been a fast-growing form of sex work, and this is beginning to be reflected in the literature, although there's still a long way to go. Financially, webcamming is a massive part of the sex industry, having generated $2 billion in revenue in 2016, with the global webcam market size expected to reach $10 billion by 2025. One common theme that appears in several of the observations is the attempt to look authentic. Performers talk directly to their viewers and have interactive components which allow performers to create unique and personalized content for every performance. This allows viewers to have an authentic experience. It is considered real interaction by the viewer. This notion is what Bernstein refers to as bounded authenticity. Viewers are provided with an authentic and intimate experience. However, many of the rooms are far from authentic, rather present a constructed authenticity. Rooms are constructed in certain ways to appear like bedrooms but lack any personal items, almost like sets from a film. Individuals choose to believe in authentic illusions that are created by content producers. This is something one of my interviewees mentions in more detail, and something I'll go on to explain a bit more later. Dobson in 2007 notes how camgirls demonstrate notions of visibility and surveillance while maintaining and representing femininity as private and contained to interior spaces. Individuals publicly display their private space and private lives, all while being in the safety of their own private space. The camgirl remains in the space traditionally assigned to her. Camgirls were often seen doing activities in their personal space, such as listening to music, posing for photos, singing, dancing, etc. The visibility of the camgirl acts as a means of reinforcing presumptions made about women belonging in the domestic space. Camgirls often have wish lists of items that viewers can purchase for them, and by choosing to make these personal private spaces visible and asking for material items in return, camgirls take the notions of private and consumer culture into a commodity. Through exploiting femininity, the camgirl receives personal and material gain. As a result, camgirls have become producers in the image market through reinforcement of traditional representations of femininity and girl culture. However, there are many that now confront webcam culture, which questions if their role is traditionally seen in the public sphere, asking if the men webcamming are disrupting this notion of gendered roles in the public and private realms. It challenges ideas of power and control through multiple ways. Webcam performers are in control of the way they are viewed. They are controlling the forms of visibility which they choose, providing a much more empowered position than submitting to traditional forms of the gaze. They dictate what they want to show on camera, with many of them having remote controls, so they can change this during a performance. They choose what they want to wear, with not all the girls that I observed being naked, some of them are fully clothed. How they want to portray themselves, whether this be a manufactured identity or their true self. However, it is difficult to assume that all these performers feel like they actually have full power and control over their work. There is a debate surrounding ideas of power through the male gaze, with scholars like White noting that camgirls may be presented in objectified and sexually normative ways. However, they are making choices on how they want to portray themselves to their viewers. However, others, including Opalina, argue that through their visibility online, women who are broadcasting themselves via webcam reproduce images that objectify the female body, which only goes to perpetuate the male gaze. There are so many other factors that play a part in this, and it's something that definitely needs further interrogation. I have started doing interviews to be used alongside my findings from my observations, so while there's still a long way to go with that, I thought it might be interesting to share some of the provisional findings with you today. I've also found a new hatred for transcribing, so how anyone does that, I don't know. My first participant is transgender and they don't use pronouns, but for ease, I'm going to refer to them as they. So they directed and set up webcam performances with their then wife, just for some background. One thing mentioned was the physical changes that had to be made to the domestic space, noting how because the bed was such a major prop and the importance of it being clean, the rest of the clutter was pushed outside the frame of the camera. The preparation side of things was putting it back to normal again, with my participants saying, well, it never really went back to normal again. It kind of stayed in this performance arena, always conscious of the next recordings. It had an effect on the bedroom space that reached beyond the time just spent on the performance. My participant also noted that it was the cleanest the bedroom had ever been, so it wasn't all bad. They stated that this not resetting of the room was normalised quite quickly. However, by the performance space constantly having to be ready to use, the marital sex stopped during that period and moved to a downstairs bedroom, which I found really interesting. An element of the domestic space being permanently altered for webcamming came from the professional standards of certain webcamming sites. Processes to even sign up to certain sites required high quality professional photographs to be sent. A lot of websites, especially ones that you have to pay more for, had quite specific and pre-scripted ideas of what the staging had to be. My participant found that you couldn't just use your camera that you already had or use your laptop webcam. You actually go out and physically buy a high quality definition one to meet the website standards, and that's largely due with upholding a website's reputation, as it all comes back to money after all. They provided a whole list of suggestions, like putting the webcam so many centimetres away from the edge of the bed, and if you were going to use a computer chair, then this chair needs to be on wheels so you can spin around quickly from the view of the camera. As mentioned before, they had to reorganise and reset their entire situation and stated they had to improvise a lot in order to meet the standards and specifications for these websites. My participant highlighted how authenticity is desired within performances. When the couple first started webcamming, they assumed that they'd have to take on an identity, a manufactured identity. However, they found that their actual identity was far more important to engage viewers. The language used by the performer was also really important. So if they were too slutty, the financial reward wasn't as great. So it was really important for them to appear authentic to their viewer and have an intelligent conversation so the viewer didn't feel like they were being belittled. They found that actually talking and experiences of being more authentic and being a real human, not being this manufactured identity, was something that was more financially beneficial for them. There's still a lot more to do, and I'm excited to do some more interviews and see how that goes. But for now, I look forward to any questions, comments, and advice that you might have. Thank you.
Fantastic, everybody. Thank you for sticking to the time limit. My biggest fear of the day. So far, so good. And a great turnout for your talk. If nobody had noticed on the participants, currently 20 people here to see your talk. So fantastic, everyone. So a couple of questions came in during this. I will start with one that was posed to all of you. Oh, here we go. So for the panel, how do you position yourself with the ideologies surrounding the studies around sex work and prostitution? Do you think sometimes radical feminists are too much or not scientific? Whoever wants to take that.
I'm voting that Connie takes.
It's always my dreaded answer. I don't know the answer to, I'm sorry, but I thank you for the question though, because it gave me something to, I teach a diversity in CJ class and I cover gender in criminal justice and the theories, but I'm new to thinking about this for kind of a book project. So I know now I have to look at that. That's a good point. I'm wondering if the person who put the question in there is thinking that the radical feminists were not empirical enough. Is that your thinking?
I guess we'll find out.
Okay, put it in the chat. Put it in the chat if you want. Oh, no. Sorry. That's not what I meant to do.
So another question that came in for you, Connie, what do you make of feminist abolitionists?
Sort of the same. I think I don't know enough about feminist abolitionists. I have encountered actually years ago I don't know if it's the same thing, a group that was wanted to get rid of all pornography. And we're trying to, I have to look more into this. I just don't know enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
You don't have to apologize to anybody. So a couple of questions for you, Kurt. Were any of the women that you interviewed streetwalkers?
One of the main ways that I recruited people was via the internet, and the project is like, what is the internet's relationship to sex work? And so that obviously it didn't rule them out, but they didn't get sampled in, people who work on street level. But there were two people in the study who started out on the street and then migrated to internet style escorting. And they had a lot of really interesting viewpoints on the difference between the two. And when, and they flatly said, when I asked, why move to the internet, they said, because it's safer. Like, having the access to the internet, being able to book clients in advance, being able to screen clients is better than standing on the street corner. And because it's just safer. And both of them said, and what I predict is a reduction of a massive reduction of street level sex work in lieu of moving online. And when you move online, if you do, you can adopt more agency in the clients you get to select, in your screening metrics, and ways to kind of like treat it and alter it more into a business as compared to just a singular transaction, on a corner. So yeah.
A question also came in for you, Kurt, about risk management. If I'm understanding the question correctly, so did you ask any of the women you surveyed about victimization directly? There's just a question about like how those conversations went, and then how much can you speak to their risk management?
Cool. Yeah, no, I can. I think what I saw the question, and I think what the asker is getting at is that I said during my presentation that I didn't ask them about victimization, and that is true. But there is an important caveat. I didn't ask them about victimization outside of work. Nobody asks librarians what terrible event led them to be a librarian. Nobody asks, people who turn into, sailors on ships, what terrible, thing made them leave home and become a sailor. So I didn't think when approaching it as sex work as work, and and approaching it as a pseudo workplace as ethnography, I wasn't like, so what in your past led you to become a sex worker? However, I did say, have you ever felt unsafe at work? And what steps do you take to ameliorate feeling unsafe at work? And they had lots of answers for that. A handful of them, not a lot, but a handful had stories of early in the work taking a client that they didn't feel comfortable with, and then that person might have tried to attack them. And then they changed their procedures to be much, much safer. So I can speak to their efforts to remain safe at work and the process by which they try and ensure their own safety. Not like things like, outside relationship, like was I in an abusive relationship with a partner, or was I abused as a child, or things like that. That wasn't of concern for my project. I mean, it's a concern for anybody, but it wasn't a concern for how do you do your job and how do you stay safe. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Francesca, a couple of questions for you. So the first one, are there links here with broader research, for example, geography, on spaces of home and work and domesticity there?
Yes, definitely. Lots of links. I think look at us, we're all presenting from our own home right now. Like, the situation has changed so rapidly, so quickly. But even before that, there's definitely been this merge of working from home. But not only that, there's been presentation of like gamers and Twitch streamers, and there's the proliferation of what we are presenting and what we want as audiences to get from the internet, I think has just grown so rapidly that, yeah, I mean, I've come from a background of kind of domestic space, home invasion. So the domestic part to me is really important. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways you could go for it.
Mm-hmm. And then the second question, they write, interesting point regarding desired surveillance. Is undesired surveillance also a problem here? For example, concerns over doxing.
Yeah.
There may be people here who don't know what doxing is.
So doxing is when a viewer would ascertain the identity of a webcam performer through various means. I think the desired surveillance is one certain perspective of one certain sex worker. Like, not all sex workers are going to have this happy, positive attitude about their work. So I think the desired surveillance only really accounts for a certain subsection of workers in general. But yeah, the undesired surveillance concerns over doxing, I think that's a concern for all webcam workers in general, but it's weighing up the cost benefit. Like someone was saying previously, the safety concerns of online work are vastly reduced if you were more traditional forms of sex work, street work, etc. So I think it's just a balance of that. If that answers your question.
So the next question is either for you or for Kurt. So from who each of you have interviewed, do they think that the stigma of sex work is improving?
What's interesting is I did get to talk to people from all over the world, and one of the more interesting places that can speak more to a reduction in stigma is Australia. The workers I talked to in Australia, one of them even was like, I got into the work without doing a lot of research, and I just thought this was something that people did, and I thought that that even though there was a stigma to it, that it wasn't nearly that severe. But then she said, I started doing a lot of reading in other places in the world, and I realized that elsewhere, especially in America, in the United States, that it's still illegal and highly, highly stigmatized. And she was like, man, we got to get out in front of this because it would be way better if it wasn't so stigmatized. So I think that the people who live in places where it is highly stigmatized hope that it becomes less stigmatized. And the people who live in places where the stigma has lowered are like, we got to do this for other places as well, because it's kind of ridiculous that it's so stigmatized. At least that was what, like I said, that's what the ones that talked to me talked about.
Francesca, anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think the stigmatization is lessening slightly through the popularization of forums and web applications like OnlyFans, because they're so mainstream now. That's doing some sort of job in making it seem less stigmatized, but I wouldn't say it's so great in England. But I think, yeah, in Australia, know what they're doing. So I think we should follow in their footsteps.
Okay, we have another abolitionist question with a little bit of lead up. So they write, in North America and some places in Europe, the abolitionist discourse is becoming mainstream, denying agency of sex workers, and has an impact on legislations, for example, human trafficking laws. I would like to hear what you think about that. For example, if it could generate prejudices on sex workers or on people contributing to their safety. I'm not sure if that's for Connie or for the entire panel, but if anybody wants to address that.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification of what the abolitionist movement is. That I think it's going to depend on the sex worker. About some will say. I think Canada recently passed some piece of legislation, and the both the clients. It's played out on chat forums, discussion boards online about how to make sense of what does it mean. I mean, in the case of real sex trafficking, it's a problem. And it's a problem for the parents of the girls if it's teenagers who get abducted. You want legislation to, to try to fix it, reduce it, get your daughters back, if it's the daughters who've been trafficked. And I mean, the stories are horrifying and they're terrifying. But yeah, I do think that I have not interviewed sex workers if I had to, but from what I've read, if I had to guess, I'm going to say that yes, some sex workers would say it's they have agency and they're not victims, and this is about choice, and they do want to protect their identity. There is a fear of being doxxed, but yeah, they're not victims. They would think that it would contribute to. I think the answer is it depends on the right people to ask about that are the workers, and it's going to depend on the worker whether how much agency they feel they have and how helpful or not helpful they feel the laws are. I guess that's my best answer at this time.
Thank you. So our last question for this morning. For you again, Kurt. Did you find any state difference between the responses in Australia, for example, Victoria versus Western Australia?
Oh, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, but I'd have to look closer at my data because I know that I had workers from New Zealand and Australia, and then different areas of Australia, and some of them in our interviews would speak to the differences, and the differences being that in one portion, and I'm going to get this wrong because, like I said, I would have to go back to my data. This is a very specific question, but that they were saying that one area had legalization much longer, and that the system just worked better. Because they had, she even said, I'm a second generation sex worker, i.e., it's been legalized there so long that she had people come before her and show her the ropes and show her the different ways that it works well, and that basically what it boils down to is, I think the point I'll stick to for this is that things take time to maturate. That like passing legislation is going to result in growing pains, and that the worker from the area that it was second generation, she was like, I feel that the system flows really effectively, it's safe for workers, and the stigma is really lowering, so much so that I recall her specifically, she became a worker after she was taking a commuter train to a job that she did not like, and someone on the train was like, oh, well, do you know what I do for a living? And they basically just started talking about it on a train, like literally strangers on the train. She was talking about it on the train to a stranger that she'd never met before, that this is what I do for a job. And she went, that sounds like a really good, it sounds way better than the job I'm doing now. I should go and do that. And she even in the interview said, I was doing it the very next day, which I find shocking. But the very next day she went in and became one. So yeah, I think that the growing pains is going to be the thing, and that the longer a system stays in place, the hopefully, not in every case obviously, but hopefully it works better for the people in that system.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for your time. We're going to wrap it up here today. Thank you again to all of our presenters and everybody who turned up this morning, whatever time zone you're in. Especially you, Lucas, coming from Australia. If you are going to stick around for the next stream, I have to reset the webinar just for recording purposes. It'll be live again at about 10 o'clock. Thanks again, everybody.